just a couple of housekeeping notes here before I forget. I was mentioning to Miss Diane just a moment ago, if you've been keeping up on the website with our classes when they are finished and going back and reviewing those, tomorrow for most of the day the website is going to be down for maintenance. I'm going to be doing some maintenance and updating on that, so those videos won't be available then, but they will be by tomorrow night, Lord willing. So I just wanted to give everybody a heads up on that. It's almost unbelievable to me that we are already this far into this study, that we are now on our next to the last week in discussing these evidences, these defenses for what we believe and why we believe it. Now, when we started all those weeks ago, we asked a question: how did we get to this point? And as we have discussed all of these topics with the idea of trying to create a logical formula by which we can show people the reliability of Scripture, the existence of God, all of these things, the proof behind why the world is as it is, what we can do towards that, the sanctity of human life, all of those things that we've discussed. We come to this point tonight where I want us to ask another question. The first we asked, of course, was how do we get to this point? Now the question is, as we're wrapping up this study in these 2 weeks, is why is this important? And I think the main reason why this is important, and it should be important to all of us, no matter your age or background, is because being able to combat these things, which are so prevalently taught in our society from a standpoint that they will respect, will help us to build the faith of the church in the future. You know, I think about our kids here and what they're going to have to face in the next few years, because from the time that they leave home and go to any state university, and even some quote-unquote Christian universities, at least that have some sort of biblical leaning, you will find professors that will do everything that they possibly can to increase that doubt, plant those seeds, and lay the framework for destroying faith. Several years ago, a denominational group brought out a series of movies, and I think they're actually working on another one now called God's Not Dead. And the premise of this story was of a young man who entered college and comes into contact with a professor in a freshman biology class who basically tries to destroy everything that he believes about God. And yet this young man is able to logically work through these things and defend his faith. Now, I wouldn't recommend that movie from a spiritual standpoint, because they reach some conclusions about salvation which I would not, specifically the mode by which we are saved and such as that. But simply as a movie to show you sort of a picture into the world that so many of our young people are entering into and have been for the last many years, but it is increasing by every day and every week. I would encourage you to read that or watch those movies, at least the first 2, God's Not Dead and God's Not Dead Part 2. Also, I want to recommend another book to you, and I'm going to be making some quotes in the lesson tonight from this book. It is a book by Brother Joe Wells, who preached in the Florence area for many years and now works for Freed Hardeman. I've met Joe on several occasions, and every time I do get the chance to talk to him, I tell him how much I appreciate this book. It is called Game Plan: Developing a Spiritually Winning Strategy for Adults and Teens in Today's Culture. And the entire premise of this book is basically what we've been studying, but from a statistical standpoint. It shows, by statistic, the amount of people who are losing their faith. It tells stories of good Christian young people who are raised in good homes that reach a certain point of life where everything goes out the window. And it gives you strategies for how to defend against such things. I have used this book in teaching classes in the past for young people. But I want to take some time to look at some of the quotes of things, specifically with the agendas. The agenda of atheism, as we've been discussing to a great degree, the idea of revisionist history, how they are attempting to attack some of the evidence that we have towards our faith by revising history with these modern standards or such. The idea of revisionist history is when a person is attempting to reevaluate or restate the past based on newly acquired standards. So they will take something from our history and they will try to color it, not by the culture of that day, but rather by the standards of culture today. And that turns the way that people look at things from time to time. The understandings that people had in the 1800s about the world around them are very different than people have about that world now, looking back upon it with our modern mindsets. And we're going to look at some of these quotes here about such things. The assault on children as well. We talked a little bit about that in the previous classes with the sanctity of life, but I want you to know some important facts that are held within this book that will show the decline of morality and the decline of a standard of what is right and what is wrong among young people that leads to these things that we're dealing with. The over-sexualization of America is another thing that is mentioned in this book. I will not deal with much of that tonight because I believe that would be something more important for you to read on your own. But it really goes through how over time we have built to this point of degradation. And I would highly, highly recommend this book. And another reason that I wanted to look at some of these issues, and we will in just a moment, is because they're coming up with new ideas or taking old ones and reframing them in ways to try to plant doubt, seeds of doubt in young people, especially even today. I don't know if you noticed it, Doug, but I was reading just a new article on Apologetics Press website even today that I wanted to mention about a new alleged Bible contradiction. At least it's not very new, but it's bringing itself back to the forefront again. It's interesting how these things will work themselves in cycles. Now they are attempting to use passages in the epistles of John to say that there is a contradiction between sin and one who can sin and one who cannot sin today. So I wanted to look at that information because
that too. One who can, one who sins, and one who can't.
Yes. They say there's a contradiction between passages which will say that it is possible to sin, and other passages will say that God cannot sin. And
wait a minute, that God cannot sin.
Yes. And so therefore, and there's a contradiction there. We're going to look at some of those details for just a moment and look at some of these passages. Brother Dave Miller, who's a good friend of mine, and I haven't seen him in quite a while, but he wrote an excellent article on this on Apologetics Press website that I would really encourage you to look at as well in your own time. But I want to look at these passages specifically because it is yet another attempt by those who would disparage the scriptures to cause doubt, to try to find a wedge, a contradiction where there is none. Brother Miller said this in his article: those who disbelieve in the inspiration of the Bible commonly call attention to passages that appear on the surface to contradict each other. You may remember we discussed some of that when we looked at the idea of the origin of sin and such as that several weeks ago. And this is a common thing that they do. They will start with some of these passages. We will present cases where these are defended, and they will eventually cycle back around to them as though they were new. And that's what they're doing now. This one is mainly based upon grammar. So as I show you how to defend these things, we'll talk a little bit about Greek grammar in a very, very simplistic way tonight, because I'm not a Greek scholar, but I understand how these parts work together. Somebody grab 1 John 1, verses 8 through 10. And then somebody else, while they're turning that, grab chapter 3, verses 6 and then verse 9.
If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say we have not sinned, we make Him a liar, and His word is not in us.
Okay, pay attention to those statements. Have no sin and have not sinned, because that is important with what they're about to bring up. Now, someone read 1 John 3, verse 6, and then verse 9.
Whosoever abideth in him sinneth not. Whosoever sinneth hath not seen him, neither known him. Verse 9. Whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin, for his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin, because he is born of God.
Okay, do you see where they're trying to pull a contradiction here? They're saying here in the first passage that we looked at, if we say we have no sin, what? We deceive ourselves. Okay? Now, on the surface, that would make us think what? If we do not claim that we have sin, we deceive ourselves, truth is not in us. But yet this other passage says that he who abides in him, who is that? The Christian. They would say, we know that, does not sin. And whoever sins has neither seen him nor known him. And whoever is born of God, who is that? The Christian, does not sin. For his seed remains in him, and he cannot sin. Not only does he not sin, but he cannot sin. They will say it is impossible for the Christian to sin. So see, they will take these two passages from this letter, and they will try to make them make loggerheads with each other. Here he says, if you have no sin, you deceive yourself, the truth's not in you. But yet here he says, the one who's born of God, you Christians, you do not sin. And better than you do not sin, you cannot sin. Now, just on the surface, does anybody have any idea how to defend against that?
When do you quit abiding in the Lord, in Christ? At what point are you not abiding in Him?
Mm-hmm. You're hitting very close to the point there, Ernie. This has to do with action, doesn't it? And really this is based upon the tenses of the verbs here. Brother Miller will do a great job here in dealing with two words that are not very familiar to us in English, but they're used quite often in the Greek language. It depends on what kind of action this is. There are two. It is linear or punctiliar. That is a really fancy word. Linear refers to a continuous action, one that you do all the time, while punctiliar is a point of action, a single event. And so we're looking at two different verbs here. They're translated as the same word in English, but the Greek word is much more intricate than that. It gives you more of an idea. That's the point. What Ernie's getting at is when you stop abiding in Him, that sin becomes what? A continual action. That's what we're talking here about with a linear verb.
I mean, it don't have to be a continuous. A sin can be a one-time thing,
Yes.
but you've always got that path back.
Right. And are there instances where, as we've talked about with grace before, perhaps in a moment of weakness, something comes out of your mouth, but that's not your manner of life? You know, the old example is, you know, what if you're on the road and all of a sudden somebody's coming towards you and a word flies out? If you die in that moment, are you done?
Out of here.
Yeah, you know, done.
I also met a religious person. He was up at Jacksonville State when I was. They would come and preach on the quad every so often.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they were of the holiness movement, and they taught. He used this passage to teach that if you are truly a Christian, you will not sin at all.
And see, that doesn't.
Okay. Does anybody in here know anybody that's never committed sin? And we're probably
Well, he would-
1 million people between all of us.
He's, you know, that was brought up, and he said that the passages that talk about the sin are aimed at pre-Christian people that have not, you know, that are not in Christ. But that once a person is in Christ, whatever his definition of that was, you live above sin and you do not commit sin, which I think is ludicrous.
Absolutely.
So,
Go ahead.
First John chapter 3, those passages there where it says he cannot sin, that's kind of summing up what he just talked about in the verses prior.
Exactly.
So if you go
Yes.
back to verse 4, it says, everyone who makes a practice of sinning
Mm-hmm.
also practices lawlessness. It goes on to talk about, basically you've got two different kinds of people. You've got children of God and children of Satan. Children of God don't make a practice.
That's it. Brother Miller used a word that I won't use, but it's a good word. It's a compunction. It's continual. It's a manner of life. Sin rules your life. That's the point where you have a problem. The difference in the verbs is there's a one-time moment where in weakness we're going to make mistakes. And that's what John's talking about in the context of that passage in 1 John 1. Because again, what is just prior to this? It is that idea of the path back. That idea of being able to return. It is a continuous action versus that which is a single incident. There's no contradiction here. As Daniel pointed out, there is a big difference between a single mistake and a continuous life of sin.
But if you're doing the continuous life of any sin, whether it be one or many, you're not abiding in Christ.
Exactly.
You're not
That's
a Christian.
it. Mm-hmm. You are not living as a Christian ought.
Correct.
You might be a Christian, but you're a wayward Christian.
Right. I'm by that.
You know.
This thought process also demonstrates how dangerous it is to grab one verse out of context.
Yes. They claim against us a lot of times, and I know you've probably heard this, Doug, and I know many of you probably have. They will make a claim against us many times of proof texting. And that idea is taking something completely out of its context to prove something that you and I believe. But here's an instance where they've done the same thing, though we don't do that, where they've done the same thing that they accuse us of, and it has led to a dangerous incident because they don't understand the full meaning here. But for a kid, you know, or a young person who doesn't understand these things or hasn't looked at these details as we're studying right now, you look at that on the surface, what's that going to tend to make you believe? When you're, you know, impressionable and you see two things put up against each other that don't seem to match. You have to do a little bit of digging. But yes.
I had another thought too, using their same logic. In 1 John chapter 1, he says, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another.
That's right.
If we walk in darkness, we don't have fellowship. So do they not go out at night? Do they leave every light on in their house?
There you go.
If they're taking everything that literal, then there you go.
Exactly.
And when these impressionable children are confronted with these types of things and people are telling them this, then us as mature
Exactly.
Christians need to be able to answer.
And
the only way
that's
we're gonna
exactly
answer
why.
is to study and learn this.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly why I'm pointing it out tonight. This is the reason why. Because I've heard brethren at times when I've taught things like this, or other friends of mine have taught things like this, and it does get technical and it gets difficult from time to time. They say, we don't need all of this. Just give us the Bible. You know, we don't need all of this scientific proof and such things as this and all of that. But you see, that's not going to be enough for some people. And those people have influence over the future generations. And if we are not able to be those that they can go back to and honestly say, see, here's what I'm struggling with. Can you help me understand this? If we can't do that, who are they going to believe? Us or the people with the letters behind their name? You know, paper trails go a long way with young folks. And I'm afraid too often we something may be a little more difficult for us, that we try to avoid those things rather than looking at it. There are other things. This is a negative instance where they will try to bring these things out and present them in new clothes, so to speak, as something new to try to catch young people. But there are other things that give them even more evidence. Take, for example, we studied archaeology one of the weeks, just this past week, and I don't know who may have seen the article or not, but recently they have found a potsherd with a very important name upon it, an Old Testament name that should be somewhat familiar to us if you remember your book of Judges. They have found a potsherd with an inscription of one named Jerubbaal or Jerubbaal. Now, does anybody remember whom that was attached to?
Gideon.
There you go. Here's more historical evidence. A potsherd with the man's name on it to show this person lived. These are not just stories. These are not just fantasies. They are not a history book. No, they're not meant directly to be a history book. But they are historical, and we can find evidence of that. Every day we're finding stuff like that. Just this past week they dug that up. For years, people have questioned whether some of these judges existed, even though we have written records that prove their existence. Here we have a physical representation of a piece of pottery that may have belonged to him or was telling that story of him, something. It mentions that other name of his, which is mentioned, I believe, in Judges chapter 6. It's either Judges chapter 6 or Judges chapter 9. Cannot remember exactly. I'd have to look it up right at this moment. But one or the other, it is there within that section of Gideon. You'll notice it. This is one of his other names. And now we have a physical piece of evidence to show that people back then knew who he was, knew that he lived, and they knew of his existence. There was no doubt there. People will try to point out evidence that cause young people to doubt about these sorts of things. And that comes from this idea of destroying their faith. They want to destroy their faith.
I believe it is Judges chapter 9 and verse 5.
9:5. Sometimes I get my 6s and 9s flipped around. There is a young man mentioned in this book. I want to tell you a little bit about this story that Joe mentions in here because it really struck a chord with me all the years back when I first read this book. In chapter 3 of this book, he will mention a young man named Derek. And this will give you an idea, which I'm sure some of us are familiar with, of the kind of pathway these young men and women often take. Here's what Joe said. His name is Derek. When we met, I was 19 or 20 years old, working as a part-time volunteer youth minister at my local congregation. Derek was about 12 years old at the time. He was a great outgoing kid with all the leadership qualities that any youth worker would want. If we needed a volunteer in class, Derek was one of the first to raise his hand. And when we were at a retreat, I didn't have to spend time worrying about him getting into trouble. He was a very well-behaved and just all-around good kid. Obeying the gospel was a natural step for him as he grew up with Christian parents and regularly attended worship, Bible classes, and youth group activities. He led singing when the congregation invited young men to do so, and he participated in things like Lads to Leaders, where he won awards for song leading and his speaking ability. He was a leader and an active Christian young man. It definitely wasn't a lack of involvement that led to his guest appearance on my podcast in 2010. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, Joe has a podcast that's relatively popular. And this young man, back several years ago, was interviewed on that podcast. In the waning time since they had first met, this young man who had everything going for him had lost his faith, had turned from God. He'd been involved in everything, he'd been given every opportunity, and yet he still lost his faith. I've heard people say sometimes, well, we're just not getting the kids involved enough. And there is a portion of that that's important. It's important to provide many avenues for them to learn and to grow and to continue to build their faith, but even then, it's not foolproof. I want you to notice the difference in the young man who we just saw, one that was active, one that was very involved, that eventually would lose his faith. I'm going to read you a portion of the interview now. Joe would say to him, let me ask you this though, brother, because again, he's just an erring brother in Christ at this moment. Because you bring to light something based on your statement, even though you grew up in the Church of Christ, you obeyed the gospel, would you call yourself a Christian today? He asked him point blank. Here's what Derek said. Oh no, no, I would not. What would you call yourself then? Are you an atheist or an agnostic? What are you? He said, I'd call myself an atheist, agnostic, humanist. I'm going to break that down some for you because it sounds like two contradictory terms. There, atheist and agnostic. Atheist means I don't believe there is a God. Agnostic means I don't know for a fact that there is or is not a God, as the same way you don't know for a fact that there is or is not a God. You have a faith and a trust and a belief in it. But it's humanist in the way that I have a faith in humanity. That in the end, humans will be for the most part, will do the right thing and realize what needs to be done to progress as a society. Joe would go on to say that sadly, Derek represents thousands of young people who have decided that the old religion of their parents isn't truly where they need to be, leaving a multitude of parents and grandparents weeping and wondering where they went wrong. Here's what the research shows. Across the religious board, approximately 75 to 90% of teenagers walk out on their faith background when they graduate high school. 75 to 90%. Y'all, the lessons that were taught, the sermons that were preached, the fellowship with other young people is merely regarded as something that an ignorant child participated in because they were in their parents' house and they were made to. When the foundation of their faith is attacked, it is too often, as Chris Martin quotes at the opening of the chapter, which I will mention in just a moment. As a kid, this is one of the singers of a popular group, Coldplay. He said this, as a kid, you don't know any better. But then you go on, the cracks begin to appear, and you're like, I'm sure I'm not sure about this heaven or hell thing. I'm not sure whether it's really wrong to be a homosexual. I'm not sure whether we're right or they're wrong. This sort of open-ended idea too often enters into the minds of these young people, 75 to 90%. But he asks the same question that we need to ask. Why? When you've provided all of these opportunities, why? And it all boils down to this. Unfortunately, too often, their faith is not made their own. They're taught things. They understand things from a logical standpoint, but they don't put themselves at the feet of the cross. They don't put themselves in that situation. I know, I've watched it in classes of young people that I've taught where their eyes are blank. They're there in body, but their mind's not there. I've watched it as they slowly turn from the things that every parent has tried to instill in them. And where does it come from? A steady diet of all these agendas that our country is trying to force down their throat. Atheism, the non-existence of God, the evolutionary theory, the homosexual agenda, the humanist agenda that mankind is the top of the food chain and therefore we do not need God. All of these things that they're faced with and that we see from a day-to-day basis, that's what's getting into their mind. I was struck by this and I thought I would include it in this lesson tonight because it was very poignant to me. The girl that cuts my hair in Pell City, her father was a denominational preacher for many, many years. So we talk about the Bible a lot when she's cutting my hair. And recently she came to me when I was in there having my hair cut and was mentioning about a young girl in the congregation of whatever denomination it is she attends. 11 years old. 11. And she came to her absolutely distraught because everyone was making fun of her in school. And she asked her, she said, well, why are they making fun of you? What's it about? And I kid you not, this young little girl, 11 years old, is being made fun of because she has taken the position that she does not know whether she is a boy or a girl. At 11 years old, she has that concept within her mind. Even though her parents have at least somewhat attempted to raise her in a biblical mindset. And the person who cuts my hair, who I dearly think a lot of, and does appreciate the Bible, and I'm hoping one day the seeds I am planting will come to fruition. But she said, what can we do when they're getting fed this by all these things, television and all of this, that these ideas are sinking into their heads? What we can do is look at things like this. Teach them the existence of God from a logical standpoint. Teach them from a scientific standpoint why these things that people claim to feel, claim to believe cannot work. Not in a harsh and hateful way, because we should not hate any person, but in a logical way that shows the fallacy of the arguments. And we need to do it earlier and more often, because these things are around them all the time. I mentioned to her a quote from John Dewey. In 1930, 3 years before Humanist Manifesto 1, John Dewey, whose decimal system we still use in elementary school libraries to this day, said that he could do more in 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to destroy the faith of the future of America than anyone could hope to do with 2 hours in a worship assembly twice a week. And he was right. As far as being able to do more to work against the faith that we're trying to instill in future generations, he could. And he has, to the point of 75 to to 90%. This book's a few years older now. The numbers are going up. 75 to 90%. So what do? Our training has to be more than just in this building. It has to be in this building and every other day they're under your roof. And nothing is foolproof. There are going to be times they're still going to abandon it. But that's going to happen from time to time. Why is it important to study these things and to keep up to date with the things that they're dealing with now, such as contradictions like this that are being brought back to the forefront? The importance of it now is that this is not going to stop. The world is not going to get better as a whole on a large scale. It never has. It has always deteriorated, and all we can do is do what we can while we can and while we have opportunity. That's why we study this. And that's why next week, as I want to do two things next week. I want to review everything that we've studied so far to make sure that we have in our hands. And also I want to answer any questions that you may have that have come up for you while we have studied this. So if you come up with some in the next week or so, get those questions to me, and I'll do what I can to help deal with those. But I don't want our young people to become stories like these in this book. I would highly encourage you to read this book. And the way that we do that is just like Ernie said. It has to be on us to help, but not just in here, in every place that we have influence. Thank you for your attention tonight. And next week as we review, I hope we are more and more ready to defend our faith, to build ourselves up, and to help those who need it in other ways as well.